And welcome back, listeners. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Threat Podcast. I am your host, Carter Wilcoxson, CEO and founder of Epic Services Company, joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt and Joanne Eby, coming in for a little bit longer, Kansas City, because I know that you guys are in a little bit of disarray between selling your home and headed back to Nevada. So how are you guys doing today?
Yeah, we're doing great. The opportunity here has wound up, and it's been a fantastic time here in Overland Park, actually, outside of Kansas City. But we expected to be here 6 weeks. Now it's almost a little bit longer than 5 years. So it's like but it's been awesome. It's a great place to be. And the people are just fantastic, and the area is just fantastic. And we've really learned to love this area. And we're actually sorry to go, but it's one of those things where we gotta move along and opportunities other places. So yeah, we're going to go back, get out to Las Vegas, and do a couple of things out there, and then potentially back to Florida, where we have some other opportunities there. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Joanne, I want to ask you before we kind of dive into, our theme this week, in time stamping at the same time, we just got done with the World Cup and Spain and Argentina. And I know you both had sort of like your expectations and favorites and, what we were wishing was going to happen. But what was it like during the finals between Spain and Argentina, between the two of you? Did you have one favorite, or were you both rooting for the same one? Not that you had your own dog in the fight, but I was just curious, which one you were pulling for, if there was one more than another between the two teams.
I was going with the sentimental favorite, Argentina, and I can't speak for Matt, but I personally enjoyed the sort of the consolation game on Saturday far more. And what I liked about that game is England just really rallied and just showed their pride in their level of skill and playing ability. And that game ended up being, for me, like a much more open-ended and fun game. And even the announcers were going crazy. And then in the second half, just seeing France like kind of come to the fore and the scoring. So as far as entertainment goes, I really enjoyed that game. It was just kind of wide open and fun. Whereas with Spain and Argentina, it was the style of the game was, I think, a lot more, careful and defensive. And I think, as the announcer said, the right team won, but I was rooting for Argentina. What can I say?
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, and listeners, thank you again for joining us for another episode. Before we get into it, I would be remiss to not also mention that Sunday was the final major of the year of the Open Championship, and what a very deserved champion, Ryan Fox from New Zealand, who won the Open Championship. And that was, for me, that was as thrilling of a final round of a major that I've seen in quite some time. Those were two huge events that happened in the world that I definitely wanted to at least give time to. But, so in our last episode, we did something pretty ambitious. We proposed a research agenda for the fiduciary profession, not a list of interesting academic topics, a set of questions the profession may actually need answered if it wants to prepare for the future. And we identified 5 themes. First, understanding fiduciary discretion. Second, identifying significant fiduciary activities. Third, designing better fiduciary organizations. Fourth, technology and fiduciary practice. And fifth, and definitely not last, developing the profession. And we also made our listeners a promise. We said we would follow that roadmap one theme at a time. So, as promised, today we begin at that very beginning. What is fiduciary discretion? How do fiduciaries actually exercise? Sorry for the pun. And why is understanding it the first research frontier? Dr. Matt, is that where we begin?
I think that's exactly where we begin. But I also want to begin with a little bit of a warning because the question sounds easier than it really is. Most fiduciary professionals already use the word discretion. They're really comfortable with that word. It already appears in governing instruments. Discretion appears in statutes and regulations, policies, committee minutes, account reviews, audit reports, and examination findings. We speak in the industry about discretionary distributions, discretionary investment authority, discretionary account acceptance, discretionary fee adjustments. So, it would just be natural to assume that the profession already understands discretion. In fact, I think that we assume that we're just discretionary experts. But using a word is not the same as understanding the phenomenon the word describes.
And Matt, knowing where authority exists is not the same as knowing how that authority is exercised. A trust document may tell us that a trustee has discretion. A policy may tell us who is authorized to exercise it in the organization. A committee minute may tell us what action was approved, but none of those by themselves explains how the fiduciary interpreted the situation.
So we may know who had authority, right? We know who that was. We may know what they did, but we may still not know how they got there. Is that what we're saying?
You always have the right words, Carter, and describe the process so well. That missing middle that you just described is where fiduciary practice actually happens.
Okay, let me get a little bit more granular then. If a trust officer reviews the governing document, instrument, whatever you want to call it, gathers the facts, follows the policy, takes the matter to committee, documents the rationale, and reaches a reasonable result, what are we still missing?
We're missing the actual exercise of discretion itself. Let's imagine a beneficiary requests $70,000 from a trust to pay college tuition for a child. The trust permits distributions for education, but the beneficiary has other resources. The trust also has a charitable remainder beneficiary. There's no allegation of misconduct, and the request falls within the trustee's authority. Now, ask several experienced trust officers what they would do. One may approve the full 70,000. One may approve part of it. One may ask the beneficiary to contribute out of their own funds. One may decline the request because the other resources are available. And several of those responses all may seem very reasonable.
So that is what discretion means then, isn't it? There's more than one permissible answer, essentially.
Yes, that's right. But that's only the beginning. The existence of more than one permissible answer explains why discretion is actually necessary. However, it does not explain how a fiduciary chooses among those answers. One fiduciary may focus on the settlor's stated commitment to education, while another may focus on the fairness between the current beneficiary and the charitable remainder beneficiary. Yet another may see the trustee's role as helping the family use that trust for an important opportunity, while another may focus on preserving assets and being able to defend the denial of a distribution. Each fiduciary may read the same document, they will know the same facts, each may satisfy the same company policy, yet each may understand the fiduciary problem differently.
And Joanne, that's the first important distinction. It doesn't mean the fiduciary can do whatever they want to do with a discretionary request. In other words, fiduciary discretion is not simply freedom from a rule. It is the work required when the rule does not fully determine the answer.
I was going to ask something, but before I do, go say that again.
Discretion is not merely freedom from a rule like Hems. Discretion is the work that is required by the fiduciary when the rule does not fully give them the answer.
And that work includes interpretation. What does the governing instrument authorize? What was the settler trying to accomplish? What interests must be considered? What does impartiality require in this situation? What is a fiduciary's proper role? What risks matter? What would make the action prudent, fair, and defensible? Those questions don't always line up neatly. They can pull against one another.
So interesting as we're talking about this, and as everybody, as the two of you know, on what it is that Epic really does as far as the creation of the language, taking into consideration hymns. But this is a whole nother, mind blow for me whenever you start thinking, oh, well, just regular hymns, but then you got to take into consideration discretion. So but fiduciary institutions do review those matters, right? They have policies, account reviews, committees, compliance, audit, regulators, and the such, right? Doesn't that make the process visible?
Well, what it does is it makes parts of the process visible. And those things are very important. But think about what most oversight systems are designed to confirm. First, was the action authorized? Then, was required documentation obtained? Was the correct approval secured? Was the action completed accurately? Was policy followed? Those are important questions, but they are primarily questions of authority, the process, and administration. They don't necessarily tell us whether a material consideration was overlooked. They don't tell us whether one concern dominated every other concern. They don't explain whether the fiduciary's understanding changed after some meaningful deliberation. And they may not tell us whether the documented rationale is the reasoning that actually produced the result, or was it just a rationale that was written afterward to support the judgment that was made?
Man, as you're saying all this stuff, I'm like literally getting more and more and more uncomfortable, just thinking about taking into consideration the grantor's intent, right? Because the file can look complete while the exercise of discretion also remains invisible.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. Inspect the container without understanding what happened inside it. The profession sees the input, it sees the output. Between them sits the black box. Facts go in and action comes out. And we often label whatever occurred in between as experience or sound fiduciary discretion. But those labels do not explain the process.
Nor does a good outcome prove that the process was sound. A weak process can occasionally produce a good outcome, and a strong process can produce an outcome that later looks unfavorable because circumstances changed or salient facts were missing. If we evaluate discretion only by the outcome, hindsight takes over.
Yeah, so I guess we can't really define good discretion as the results worked out.
Yeah, of course not. And we cannot define it simply as the fiduciary was experienced. Experience matters enormously, but two highly experienced fiduciaries can disagree. Experience can deepen insight, but it can also reinforce habit. It can reveal patterns. It can also make a familiar pattern appear where the facts are actually different. So when experienced professionals disagree, saying, use experience, does not resolve the issue. It reveals the issue. It reveals how each professional's individual experience shapes what they see in the facts and how they exercise discretion.
I mean, that sounds, kind of familiar, the things we've said throughout this series, right? Disagreement is not necessarily evidence that someone failed. Disagreement, to what you've been saying for a long time, Dr. Matt, is data, right? And in this case, it may be evidence that discretion is present.
Perfectly stated. Where reasonable fiduciaries can disagree, something important is happening. Different considerations are being recognized. Different weight is being given to those different considerations. Different understandings of the fiduciary role may be operating. That variation is not noise to be eliminated before research begins. As you said, Carter, that difference is data.
And this is why the question matters beyond beneficiary distributions. Discretion appears in account acceptance. Should the institution accept a trust with a concentrated family business, contentious beneficiaries, unusual assets, or ambiguous terms? It appears in principal and income allocation. It appears in investment portfolio construction, in the retention or sale of special assets. It appears in fee setting and fee adjustment. It appears in the selection and oversight of agents to assist with the trusts. It appears in resolving conflicts and balancing competing beneficiary interests. The facts can change, authority changes, but the deeper professional act remains. A fiduciary must interpret what responsibility requires when no rule supplies the complete answer.
As you were saying that, I just, my mind again, this is this is awesome. So perhaps the profession has been looking at discretion mainly as a legal grant of authority, but you're asking us to look really at it as a human professional process.
Once again, so well stated. Law creates the space in which discretion may be exercised, but in reality, it's people who exercise discretion. And if people exercise it, then we should be able to study how they do so. That is the pivot this episode asks the profession to make.
I can already hear an objection. Someone may say, discretion is subjective. Everyone, every trust is different. Every family is different. You cannot reduce fiduciary discretion to a formula. Are we trying to do that? Reduce discretion to just a formula?
Not at all. And that objection that you just mentioned contains an important warning. We should not assume there is one correct answer to every discretionary question. We should not reduce discretion to a formula. We should not build an algorithm that merely replaces one professional's unexplained instinct with a system programmers design with unexplained assumptions. But there is a false choice hiding inside the objection. Our choices are not either turn discretion into a formula or accept it as unknowable. We can study a process without pretending the process is merely mechanical.
I think that's right, Matt. If I think about other professions that exercise judgment, like medicine, medicine studies clinical reasoning without claiming that every patient is identical. Or jurisprudence, courts will examine legal reasoning without claiming that every case has only one possible interpretation. Other professions study how experts interpret complex facts under certainty. The individuality of the case makes the need for disciplined inquiry more important, in my opinion, not less.
Well, then let me ask the question, what exactly would we observe, right? Because we cannot see discretion in the way we can see whether a form was signed.
We can begin by listening to how fiduciaries explain what they notice and what they believe matters. In my research, I asked experienced trust officers to respond to the same fiduciary situation. The important finding was not simply that they reached different conclusions, it was that their explanation revealed recurring dimensions of discretion. We described those in earlier episodes, and those dimensions we had as the acronym we called AFIRE, AFIRE, anchors, fairness, identity, risk, and emotion, which influences how those other considerations are held together.
Yeah, so let's do this. Let's outline each of those in detail. What are anchors?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Anchors are the sources fiduciaries treat as authoritative or stabilizing. For example, the governing document, law, policy, precedent, the settler's expressed intent. An anchor helps answer, what am I required or authorized to do? But anchors still require interpretation. Two fiduciaries can read the same language and emphasize different provisions or purposes.
Fairness, on the other hand, concerns how the fiduciary understands the interests of those affected. That may include impartiality among current and remainder beneficiaries, consistency with similar cases, responsiveness to a beneficiary's actual circumstances, or a concern that technically equal treatment would not be equitable treatment among beneficiaries. Fairness is not just about being nice. It is a fiduciary consideration that can become very difficult when legitimate interests compete.
Okay, and I'm not sure which one of you want to take this one. What about identity?
I'll take that. Identity asks, who do I understand myself to be in this role? And that's asked, of course, by the trust officer. One trust officer may see the fiduciary role primarily as the guardian of the trust. Another may see their role as the steward, carrying out a long term purpose. Another may understand the role as an advisor, helping a beneficiary use the trust constructively. Another may see the fiduciary role as a strategist, balancing multiple objectives over time. Those professional identities influence what the fiduciary notices, which provisions to emphasize, and what responsible action actually feels like.
So, Joanne, I actually want to ask you about risk. How does that come into play?
Well, risk concerns uncertainty, consequences, sustainability, and defensibility. Ask what could go wrong with this decision. Ask what precedent might this create? How will this affect the trust over time? Could the action be explained to beneficiaries? Could it be explained to a court, an auditor, a regulator, or the board of the trust company? Risk is an essential component, but a distorted understanding of risk can turn what best serves the trust into what is the safest decision for our trust company. Those things do not necessarily produce the same result.
Yeah, and emotion obviously is different from the other four pretty significantly, I'm assuming.
Yeah, just as you can tell by and through inspection of looking at the five, emotion doesn't fit with the other four. It's not just simply another consideration along with the other ones, though it can influence how the fiduciary integrates all four of the others. Anxiety may cause risk to dominate. Empathy may make one's beneficiary's immediate need more vivid than a remainder interest. Frustration may affect how a repeated request is interpreted. Confidence may allow a fiduciary to tolerate ambiguity. Fear may drive the fiduciary toward the most defensible answer rather than the most faithful one. Emotion does not automatically corrupt discretion, it carries information. But unexamined emotion can distort the process extremely significantly.
Yeah, this is where the subject becomes extremely real because a fiduciary can honestly believe I'm just following the document. All the while, other influences are also going to be present.
Yeah, it's so obvious. A very human process. And that's why documentation of the rationale used when making discretionary judgment alone is simply not enough. People do not always have full access to the reasons that influence them, especially after the fact, and they may describe their reasoning using the language that their institution rewards. Our proposition here of engaging in a formal and rigorous research program would study this discretionary phenomenon and would not rely on just one method of post judgment documentation. We might use interviews, common case scenarios, observation of committee deliberation, comparison of written rationales with spoken discussion, surveys and diagnostic instruments, experiments that vary one fact at a time, or a longitudinal study of how discretion changes with experience, role, organizational pressure, or new information.
And the sequence of the research results and implementation will matter. I don't think we should rush from an initial framework to a scorecard. First, we'd have to describe the phenomenon carefully. Then I imagine we test whether the dimensions hold across different institutions, different fiduciary activities, different roles, and different populations. Then examine how those all interact. And ask what patterns are associated with more coherent or more distorted exercises of discretion. Only after that can it be decided what can responsibly be measured.
So you used the word coherent. Why not simply say good discretion?
That's a great question, Carter, because good can collapse several different questions into one. Was the action lawful? Was the process careful? Were relevant interests considered? Was the rationale consistent with the fiduciary's obligations? Did the outcome later prove beneficial? Those are related questions, but they're not identical. Coherence asks whether the fiduciary's understanding of the facts, authority, competing interests, role, and risk can be integrated into a rationale that makes sense as a whole. It doesn't guarantee that every reasonable fiduciary will agree.
And disagreement may actually improve coherence. If a committee member says, "We've discussed the current beneficiary's need, but we have not considered the remainder beneficiaries," that is useful tension. If someone asks, "Are we applying policy or are we allowing policy to substitute for the governing document?" that can improve the exercise of discretion. If someone asks, "Are we protecting the trust or are we protecting ourselves?" that can reveal a distortion. The objective is not artificial consensus. The objective is disciplined consideration.
Disciplined consideration. I love that actually. So a unanimous committee can still exercise weak discretion. And at the same time, a committee with disagreement can exercise strong discretion.
Absolutely. Unanimity tells you that people ultimately voted the same way. It doesn't tell you whether the right tensions surfaced before the vote.
Another great point, Joanne, and leading to another critical distinction. The object of the proposed study is not merely the answer. The object of a formal study is the path by which the answer formed.
And that may be the focal point of this episode, right? The industry documents the discretionary conclusions that are made. Research would study the formation of the judgment used to make those conclusions.
Once again, so well stated. And once that process becomes visible, several new questions become answerable. Questions such as, do novice and experienced fiduciaries notice different facts? Does the language of a policy anchor reasoning too early? Do individual fiduciaries reason differently after committee deliberation? Does organizational hierarchy suppress legitimate disagreement? Does time pressure make risk dominate? Does personal identification with a beneficiary affect perceptions of fairness? Do repeated requests create emotional fatigue? Does documentation capture reasoning or merely justify the result? All of those questions are potential research questions. They would move the industry beyond asking experienced people, what do you usually do? They would explore what is actually occurring, why it occurs, and under what condition it changes.
Here's the thing, before we close part one, let's give our listeners the 3 aha moments that have emerged from this conversation, especially as far as I'm concerned. For me, the aha moment that really resonates is that fiduciary discretion is not simply the authority to choose among permissible actions. It is, in fact, the interpretive work required when governing rules and known facts do not fully determine what fiduciary responsibility requires. Joanne, do you have maybe another aha moment here that I'm not thinking about?
For me, what really resonates is that a documented and defensible result does not by itself reveal the quality of the discretion behind it. So all those things that auditors and the regulators look at, everything can be just tied up neat as a bow, but it doesn't reveal the quality of that discretion. I think to understand fiduciary practice, we must examine the path by which the result formed, not only the result itself. Matt, what about you?
Yeah, I think that we've talked about this before, and a reasonable disagreement among experienced fiduciaries is not a problem to eliminate. It is evidence that different considerations, professional identities, experiences, and interpretations may be shaping the exercise of discretion itself. And that variation gives research something very, very important to study.
You know, we began today with what sounded like a pretty simple question. What is fiduciary discretion? And we discussed that discretion is not simply the authority granted in a trust instrument, a statute, or policy. It is not merely experience, although critically important. It is not the final vote of a committee. It is not the rationale that appears in the file after an action has been approved. Discretion, at the heart of it, is the professional process that connects the facts and the authority to the action.
That's right. It's the process through which a fiduciary interprets governing obligations, competing interests, professional role, risk, and emotional tension. Those considerations may not point in the same direction, and that is precisely why discretion is necessary.
And for my entire time in the industry, which is now decades and probably over generations, much of that process has simply remained inside the fiduciary. We have seen the request, we have seen the approval, we have seen the documentation, But as far as I know, we had not studied how the fiduciary moved from one to the other. That's the black box we are opening, and we're trying to look inside. Not because we believe every fiduciary should reach the same answer, and not because we want to reduce discretion to a formula. We are opening it because the profession cannot create knowledge about something it has never learned to observe.
So perfectly stated. And AFIRE, your acronym, gives us an initial vocabulary for what may be occurring inside that process, right? Anchors, fairness, identity, risk, and emotion. It does not give us the final answer, however, but it gives us a path, a way to begin asking better questions, in my humble opinion.
I agree. I think of questions like, what does the fiduciary notice? What does the fiduciary emphasize? What tension arises? What changes through deliberation? And what might the fiduciary or the institution be failing to see?
Yeah, but making, discretion visible as opposed to invisible creates a new challenge. Once we can begin to see how discretion forms, what do we do with that knowledge? Can we evaluate discretion without declaring one correct answer? Or can we identify when discretion is coherent and when it is becoming distorted? Can discretion actually be measured? And ultimately, is what I think we're all trying to accomplish here, can it be improved?
I think those questions require another conversation because making discretion visible is only the first step. The next step is learning how to improve it without destroying the very thing that makes discretion necessary.
Yeah, and here's the thing, listeners. That is where we will continue our next episode. Part 2 of today's discussion, from visibility to improvement. I think that's what we're going to really hone in on. Most organizations, they really move past these topics. We don't. For Joanne and Dr. Matt Eby, I'm Carter Wilcoxson, thanking you again, as is normal, for joining us for another episode of the Invisible Thread Podcast. And make sure to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast out there today. So, Dr. Matt, Joanne, once again, thank you for allowing me in on this entire journey. And I really do appreciate the knowledge that you guys continue to give not only me, but also all of our listeners.
Thanks for being a great host again, Carter, and my co-host, Joanne, for all the insights and all the work that you're doing on this. And I think that somebody on LinkedIn said that it's a fantastic team, and I couldn't agree with them more. So looking forward to our next episode here as we explain a little bit more about how we get from good to great.
Yeah, awesome. So, hey, until next time, we will see you on the Invisible Threat Podcast. Thank you, everybody.